The Great Famine of 1315 was a disaster that changed the course of medieval history, causing widespread suffering across Europe. It lasted for several years and had consequences that rippled through societies, affecting everything from politics to cultural practices. Imagine a time when crops failed, food became scarce, and the climate turned against the people. This was the reality of the Great Famine. The disaster didn't just happen overnight, and its causes were a complex mix of natural and social factors. Before the famine struck, Europe had already been experiencing some tough years. The period leading up to 1315 was marked by a series of harsh winters and cool summers. These unusual weather patterns created an unstable environment for farming, which was the backbone of life during the Middle Ages. Crops weren't growing as they should, and people began to notice the changes in the land. In addition to the cold weather, there were also heavy rains, which flooded fields and ruined what little crop growth had managed to survive. As a result, food became scarce and people started to worry. But these environmental factors were just the beginning. The people of medieval Europe lived in a society where food was a central part of the economy, and most people were dependent on farming. With crops failing year after year, the pressure on the agricultural system grew, making the situation even worse. The people, already struggling from a difficult climate, had to face even more hardship as the food supply dwindled. People relied on the land for their survival, and with the land not providing, they were left in a desperate position. Entire communities found themselves facing a growing food shortage. This wasn't just a problem for the poor peasants. The impact of the famine spread through all levels of society. As people started to feel the effects of the crop failures, social tensions began to rise. The rich and the poor were both affected, but in different ways. The wealthier people could still afford to buy food, but as food prices soared, it became harder and harder to maintain the same standard of living. The poor, who relied on their own crops, had nothing to fall back on. They were the most vulnerable. People were forced to abandon their homes in search of food, leading to a massive migration of people across Europe. As the famine dragged on, it became clear that it wasn't just a temporary setback. People were dying of hunger, and with malnutrition weakening their bodies, diseases spread quickly. The lack of proper medical knowledge and resources meant that many of those who became ill didn't stand a chance. Communities were devastated by the loss of life, and the social order began to break down. It wasn't just a crisis of food, it was a crisis of survival. And as people searched for answers, there was no clear solution to their suffering. It was a period of uncertainty and fear, and many began to look for someone or something to blame. The impact of the famine would go on to shape the course of European history. It was more than just a food crisis, it was a turning point. Society was forced to adapt to a new reality where nothing was guaranteed. This was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315, an event that would change everything. And as we dive deeper into this story, we'll explore what happened, why it happened, and how it changed the world forever. The Great Famine of 1315 did not just end with the failures of crops or the hunger that followed. The crisis went on to reveal the deep flaws in medieval society, exposing how fragile everything really was. The effects of the famine began to spread far beyond food shortages, influencing the social, political, and economic systems of the time. As the famine worsened, Europe found itself in a state of chaos, struggling to maintain a sense of order and stability. The impact on the population was devastating, and the shockwaves would continue to be felt for years to come. By the time the famine reached its peak, agriculture had been severely disrupted. Fields that once produced bountiful harvests now lay empty or flooded. Even the most successful farmers couldn't escape the destruction. The lack of grain and other basic food sources meant that people were struggling to feed themselves and their families. And the food that could be found was incredibly expensive, pushing the poor further into poverty while widening the gap between the rich and the rest of society. Many landowners were forced to raise the prices of their goods just to cover their losses, creating a perfect storm of economic instability. In the face of this, the nobility and the ruling classes were also not spared. The medieval social system was rigid, and even the wealthy were dependent on a steady flow of food to maintain their position. With their supplies running low, tensions between the wealthy landowners and the lower classes escalated. Some of the nobility began to raise taxes to compensate for their losses, making it even harder for peasants to survive. In some areas, local rebellions broke out as desperate peasants fought for their right to food, seeing no other option but to take a stand. As the famine stretched on, it became clear that there was no easy solution to the crisis. The poor harvests were not only caused by bad weather, but were compounded by the lack of proper farming techniques and resources. Most of Europe's population still relied on outdated agricultural methods, and the social structure kept many people from accessing the tools and knowledge needed to deal with changing environmental conditions. The farmers who were struggling the most didn't have the luxury of experimenting with new methods or crops. They had to make do with what they had, and what they had was not enough. This situation left the most vulnerable people exposed to the harshest consequences. With food in short supply, many of the poorer classes turned to desperate measures. In some cases, communities began to forage for wild plants or even resorted to eating animals they would normally never consider. This, however, wasn't a permanent solution. These alternative food sources didn't provide the necessary nutrition to sustain life for long, and the lack of food and poor diet weakened people's immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Disease, which had always been a threat, became an even greater danger during the famine. The weakened population was now an ideal breeding ground for illness. Plague outbreaks were common during this period, and they spread more easily due to the malnutrition and overcrowding that came with the famine. People began dying from diseases like dysentery and typhus, in addition to hunger. It's believed that the famine's death toll was made even worse by these diseases, which killed thousands more who were already weakened by lack of food. Social and cultural upheaval also marked the Great Famine of 1315. The constant struggle for survival led many people to turn to their faith, seeking solace in religion. Churches were filled as people prayed for an end to the famine. Some saw the famine as a punishment, believing that it was the result of their sins or divine wrath. Others looked to religious leaders for guidance, but even they were not immune from the suffering. Church leaders were also dealing with dwindling resources, and many were forced to close their doors to the needy. This led to an erosion of trust in the church as people began to question why the divine had allowed such suffering to take place. While many turned to religion for answers, some saw the famine as evidence of deeper systemic problems within medieval society. The rigid class structures, poor governance, and failure to adapt to changing environmental conditions all contributed to the scale of the disaster. The nobility's inability to respond effectively to the needs of their people further fueled dissatisfaction. People were beginning to realize just how interconnected everything was. The breakdown of the agricultural system didn't just affect food, it caused a domino effect that touched every aspect of life, from the economy to religion to the very fabric of society itself. As we continue to explore this dark chapter in history, it's important to understand that the Great Famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reflection of a world that was unprepared for the challenges of its time. The problems it exposed would continue to reverberate throughout Europe for years to come, shaping the course of history in ways that were yet to be seen. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a crisis. It was a turning point in medieval history, one that showed just how fragile human society really was. And as we move forward, we'll see how these events continued to unfold and what long-lasting effects they had on Europe and beyond. As the Great Famine of 1315 continued to wreak havoc on Europe, it became clear that the catastrophe wasn't just an isolated event. The effects were deeply intertwined with the environmental, social, and economic systems that defined medieval life. While the famine's immediate impact was felt in the loss of food, the long-term effects began to emerge in the form of lasting social changes, economic disruption, and shifts in the balance of power. The consequences would go far beyond the crops that failed, shaping the future of Europe in ways that were difficult to predict. One of the major shifts that resulted from the Great Famine was the movement of people. As the famine persisted, many people in rural areas were forced to abandon their homes in search of food, shelter, or better opportunities in cities. This created a massive migration of people, and for the first time, large numbers of people who were once tied to the land began to seek refuge in urban centers. Cities, which had already been struggling with overcrowding, now found themselves overwhelmed with the influx of people. This sudden increase in population put immense pressure on resources, further exacerbating the food shortages and leading to even more social unrest. The cities themselves, however, weren't much better off. As agriculture failed, trade routes were disrupted, and towns that relied on rural supplies found themselves with empty markets. Urban populations were also hit hard by the famine, with many people now forced to rely on what little could be found in the cities. Prices for food soared to unattainable heights, and as wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the remaining food supplies, tensions rose between the wealthy and the impoverished. The rising cost of food, combined with the scarcity of work, led to social unrest in the cities, and some urban areas saw outbreaks of riots and violence. In some cases, desperate citizens took to the streets to protest their conditions, demanding that the ruling classes address the crisis. But despite their protests, little help came. The famine's economic impact also extended far beyond the immediate consequences of crop failures. The collapse of the agricultural system sent shockwaves through the medieval economy, which was primarily dependent on farming. The agricultural losses not only affected the food supply, but also devastated the trade in agricultural goods. Landlords, unable to produce the crops they relied on, began to struggle financially. Many were forced to borrow money from local moneylenders, and with debts piling up, some landowners were unable to keep up with their obligations. This led to the bankruptcy of several large estates, creating a ripple effect that affected the entire economy. Trade networks that were vital for the distribution of food and goods across Europe were also hit hard. The famine disrupted transportation routes, making it difficult for food to reach its destination. Merchants who once thrived in the movement of goods found their markets drying up, and many traders found themselves unable to pay their workers or keep their businesses afloat. Without the necessary food and goods flowing through the region, many people found themselves in desperate situations, forced to take whatever jobs they could, often at reduced wages or under deplorable conditions. The ripple effects of these economic disruptions lasted long after the famine ended, contributing to further instability in the years that followed. The devastating environmental changes that were occurring during this time were also central to the ongoing crisis. The Little Ice Age, which began around the turn of the 14th century, was a period of colder temperatures and extreme weather. This global cooling affected Europe in particular, and the consequences were felt in every corner of the continent. Cool summers, harsh winters, and excessive rainfall led to poor harvests and crop failures, which were further compounded by the lack of effective farming techniques. Without the ability to grow enough food, entire communities were left vulnerable to the ravages of famine. These climatic conditions didn't just affect crops, but also the animals that people relied on for food and labor. Livestock also suffered during this period, with many animals dying from diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the time. This had a further impact on the food supply, leaving people with even fewer resources to survive. One of the key factors that made the famine so devastating was the lack of understanding about the climate and its changes. Medieval society had no concept of climate change in the way we do today, and the people living through the Great Famine were left struggling to comprehend what was happening. There were no modern scientific tools to predict weather patterns, and the knowledge needed to adapt to such drastic changes simply didn't exist. This lack of knowledge meant that communities were largely unable to prepare for the drastic environmental shifts, and when the climate began to turn, there was no way for people to adjust. As a result, the impact of the famine was much more severe than it would have been had there been greater awareness and understanding of the situation. The famine also highlighted the vulnerabilities of medieval society, especially the ways in which social and political systems were not equipped to respond to such a widespread crisis. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, left peasants at the mercy of the land and their lords. In times of hardship, the poor were the first to suffer, and the wealthy landowners had little incentive to change the system that kept them in power. The growing dissatisfaction with the ruling classes fueled anger among the lower classes, and in some areas, this unrest led to revolts. The strain on the social fabric of society became clear as people who had once been bound to their estates began to question their place in the world. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a disaster, it was a wake-up call. It exposed the fragile nature of medieval life, where a few bad harvests could lead to widespread catastrophe. It revealed the deep economic divides that existed between different classes and showed how a small change in the environment could cause massive social and political upheaval. The impact of the famine, combined with the existing hardships of the time, would set the stage for even greater challenges in the years that followed. The reverberations of the famine would continue to affect Europe for decades, and its lessons would not be easily forgotten. As we look at the aftermath, we'll see how these events shaped the course of European history and influenced the future of the continent in profound ways. As the Great Famine of 1315 continued to devastate Europe, the social and political consequences of the crisis began to unfold. The strain on the population, combined with the widespread hunger and suffering, began to erode trust in the established systems of power. The Church, which had long been seen as a spiritual and social anchor in European society, found itself facing increasing criticism. Many believe that the famine was a form of divine punishment, and as a result, the church's ability to provide solace to the suffering masses was tested like never before. Despite the church's traditional role as a source of comfort, people began to question its authority and its failure to provide effective aid during such a catastrophic event. The religious explanations for the famine, such as the idea that it was a punishment for sin, did little to alleviate the suffering of the masses. As the famine dragged on, many began to feel that the church was disconnected from their daily struggles. Instead of providing tangible help, the church seemed to focus more on maintaining its power and wealth. This led to widespread disillusionment among the lower classes, who had long looked to the clergy for guidance and support. In some cases, this distrust would fuel the growing dissatisfaction with the existing social order. The nobility, too, found themselves facing increased pressure. Many of the landowners who had relied on agricultural production for their wealth found themselves in financial ruin. Unable to meet their obligations or provide for their peasants, some noble families were forced to sell off land or take on massive debts. The economic instability caused by the famine weakened the foundations of the feudal system, and many peasants began to push for reforms. In some regions, this led to uprisings and revolts as the lower classes sought to hold the nobility accountable for their perceived negligence. These acts of resistance were not always successful, but they revealed the growing divide between the rich and the poor and demonstrated the cracks in the feudal structure that had once been so dominant in Europe. One of the most significant consequences of the Great Famine was its impact on the workforce. As the famine continued, many people were unable to work due to illness or malnutrition. This severely disrupted the agricultural sector, which was heavily dependent on manual labor. Fields went untended, and crops that might have survived the difficult weather conditions were left to rot. This not only exacerbated the food shortage, but also had a ripple effect on other industries that relied on agricultural goods. The shortage of workers in agriculture also meant that wages for those who were still able to work rose, but these higher wages were often not enough to offset the rising cost of living. Those who were employed were often working in appalling conditions, with little protection from the effects of the famine. As a result of the labor shortages, the agricultural system in many parts of Europe began to shift. With fewer peasants available to work the land, some lords turned to more intensive farming techniques or adopted different crops that might be more resilient to the changing climate. However, these efforts were not always successful, and many areas continued to suffer from crop failures. Some regions experienced a shift in the types of crops that were grown, with more emphasis being placed on livestock and dairy farming as a way to diversify the food supply. This shift would have lasting consequences for the agricultural economy, as it set the stage for changes in farming practices that would continue for centuries. The collapse of the agricultural system also had a profound effect on trade. With fewer crops to trade, the movement of goods across Europe slowed to a crawl. The disruptions to transportation networks and the loss of food and raw materials led to the collapse of many local markets. Merchants who had once thrived in the bustling towns found themselves unable to sell their goods, and many traders were forced to abandon their businesses altogether. This economic collapse had a ripple effect on all levels of society, from the poorest laborers to the wealthiest merchants. For many, the famine was a stark reminder of how fragile the medieval economy was and how easily the complex web of trade, labor, and agriculture could unravel. The social unrest caused by the famine and the economic instability it created also had political ramifications. In some regions, the local nobility began to lose control over their subjects, as peasants and workers grew more disillusioned with the existing order. The revolts that broke out in response to food shortages and economic hardship were sometimes brutally suppressed, but they also highlighted the tensions that were simmering just below the surface. In the aftermath of the famine, many rulers realized that they needed to take action to restore order and rebuild the trust of their people. Some turned to new methods of taxation or introduced policies designed to stabilize the economy, while others sought to strengthen their authority through force. The political landscape of Europe was forever changed by the famine, and in some areas, the power of the nobility would never fully recover. The Great Famine's long-lasting impact on Europe would not be fully felt until years later, but it set the stage for many of the challenges that would face the continent in the coming centuries. The environmental changes that triggered the famine were only the beginning. The social, political, and economic consequences of the disaster would continue to ripple through European society for generations to come. The famine exposed the fragility of the medieval world and demonstrated how a combination of climate, social unrest, and economic instability could combine to create a perfect storm of disaster. In the years that followed, Europe would face even greater challenges, including the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. But the lessons learned from the Great Famine of 1315 would never be forgotten. The world would never be the same again. The Great Famine of 1315 marked a turning point in the history of Europe. It not only caused immense suffering, but also set in motion a series of events that would shape the future of the continent. As the famine slowly began to subside, the long-term consequences became clear. The environmental, social, and political upheaval it caused would continue to influence Europe for generations to come. The effects of the disaster would ripple through society, leaving a lasting legacy that would help define the Middle Ages. In the wake of the famine, Europe faced new challenges that only deepened the sense of instability. The loss of life, the economic collapse, and the weakening of the feudal system left the continent vulnerable to further disruptions. For many, the famine had exposed the fragile nature of medieval society and the vulnerability of the people who lived within it. As the population began to recover, Europe's leaders struggled to rebuild and stabilize their kingdoms, but the damage had already been done. Trust in the ruling classes had been shattered, and many people began to question the traditional power structures that had once been so dominant. The church, which had long held a position of authority, found its influence waning. The suffering caused by the famine, combined with the church's failure to offer effective relief, left many people questioning its role in society. Over time, this disillusionment contributed to a rise in skepticism and a challenge to the authority of the clergy. Though the church remained a powerful institution, the seeds of the religious reform movements that would later shake Europe were planted during this period. Politically, the aftermath of the famine saw the rise of new social movements. Peasants and workers who had borne the brunt of the suffering began to demand changes to the existing order. The failure of the feudal system to protect the most vulnerable led to growing unrest, and some regions saw the rise of peasant revolts. While that these uprisings were often brutally suppressed, they signaled a growing desire for change. The old system of land ownership and labor was no longer able to provide the stability it once had. In the years that followed, Europe would experience further upheavals, including the Black Death, which would decimate the population once again. The lessons learned from the Great Famine, however, would remain as a reminder of the fragility of life. Economically, the long-term consequences of the famine were profound. The agricultural system, which had been the backbone of medieval society, was forever changed. The labor shortages and the devastation of crops led to a shift in farming practices, with some regions moving away from traditional crops in favor of livestock and dairy. The collapse of the markets and the disruption of trade routes led to a decline in the prosperity of many regions. Though recovery was possible, it would take years before the economy could regain its previous strength. The economic instability created by the famine also paved the way for future conflicts, including the 100 Years' War, which further strained Europe's resources. As Europe slowly recovered from the famine, the scars left by the disaster remained. The environmental changes that had triggered the crisis were not easily forgotten. The extreme weather events that had caused the crop failures continued to serve as a reminder of how unpredictable nature could be. While some areas rebuilt and regained their former stability, others were left in ruin. The Great Famine had exposed the vulnerability of the medieval world and shown how quickly things could unravel when a crisis struck. The tragedy of the Great Famine of 1315 left an indelible mark on European history. It was a reminder that even in the most prosperous times, society could be brought to its knees by a combination of environmental, social, and economic forces. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would resonate through the centuries, as Europe faced further challenges in the form of war, plague, and political instability. Yet even in the face of such devastation, humanity's ability to rebuild and adapt would remain a constant theme in the centuries to come. As we look back at the events of the Great Famine and its aftermath, we are reminded that history is not just a series of isolated events, but a complex web of interconnected forces that shape our world. The legacy of the Great Famine is a powerful reminder of the fragility of human civilization and the need to understand and learn from our past. The scars left by the famine may have faded, but the lessons of resilience and the importance of unity in the face of adversity remain as relevant today as they were in the early 14th century.